I've buried men I liked and forgotten men I loved, and I never thought either of those facts made me anything special. What I'm about to tell you isn't about a gunfight, or a cattle drive, or any of the things men my age lie about on porches when their knees go bad. It's about two children who weren't mine, a promise I made without meaning to, and the winter it nearly cost me to keep it. I keep a ledger, always have. Every steer, every nail, every dollar in and dollar out, my father taught me that a man who can't account for his own days has already started losing them. So when I tell you I remember the exact date those two showed up at my gate, November the 9th, the year the Cimarron froze early, you can believe me, because I wrote it down before I understood what it meant. I wrote 2 Indian children, no shoes, girl won't speak, boy won't leave her. That's all. $4 of flour and a lie I told myself about how long they'd stay. You're going to want them to be saved. I want to warn you now that saving isn't a clean thing. It isn't a moment. It's 1,000 small refusals to give up on a Tuesday when nobody's watching and there's no reward at the end of it. Stay with me anyway. Because by the time the ice broke on that river, I'd learned the difference between a man who does the decent thing and a man who keeps doing it, and I'm still not sure which one I turned out to be. Let me start where it started, with a knock that wasn't a knock because a child too weak to knock just leans. The leaning is what I heard first. Not a knock, a slow, sliding weight against my door, the kind a sack of feed makes when you set it down wrong and it tips. I'd been at the table with the lamp low, working my figures for the month, and I remember I didn't even get up right away. Winter makes a man hoard his warmth. I told myself it was the wind, or a dog, or the door settling, and I dipped my pen and wrote the number for the culled heifer I'd sold to Pettigrew, and I went on being a coward for about 40 more seconds. Then I heard the cough. It was a small cough. That's the thing about it. It was such a small, wet, tired little cough that it went straight past my ears and into some older part of me, the part that remembers being small myself. I set the pen down. I remember the pen because I set it in the crease of the ledger and it rolled and I didn't fix it. And that pen mark is still in that book. A thin blue river across the 9th of November because I never went back and blotted it. I opened the door and the cold came in like it had been waiting. There were 2 of them. The girl was maybe 9, maybe younger. Hunger makes them smaller than their years, so I never did learn her real age until much later. She was the one leaning, her shoulder against my doorframe, her eyes half shut, her breath coming in those little coughs. The boy stood in front of her like a fence. He couldn't have been more than 11, and he had his arms out a little from his sides, the way a man stands when he means to fight and knows he'll lose. His feet were bare and blue-white and cracked at the heels, and he was standing on my frozen step like it didn't cost him anything, though it must have cost him everything. They were Apache. I knew that the way you know weather. Their clothes told me and their faces told me, and the fact that they were out here alone in that year told me the rest. That whatever family they'd had was gone in one of the ways families were gone in that country then, and I won't pretend I didn't do the arithmetic on my own doorstep. Half the county would have shut the door. A quarter would have shut it and reached for a rifle. I've never been proud of much, but I'm a little proud that I didn't do either, though I'll be honest with you. It wasn't kindness that stopped me. It was that cough. You can close a door on an idea. It's harder to close one on a sound. The boy said something, not to me, to her, low and fast, a hand going back to touch her arm without his eyes ever leaving mine. I didn't have his language, but I've worked cattle my whole life, and you learn to read a thing that's frightened and trying not to show it, and I read him plain. I'm here. Don't fall. Don't fall in front of this man. Come in, I said. My voice came out rougher than I meant. Come on, get in out of it. He didn't move. Of course he didn't. Why would he trust a word out of me? I stood there feeling like a fool, the heat pouring out past my legs into the night, and I did the only thing I could think of, which was to step back all the way back out of the doorway, till there was the whole width of the room between me and them and nothing between them and the fire. I sat down at my table. I picked my pen back up. I pretended to work. It's a trick I learned with half-broke horses. You can't invite a scared thing in. You can only stop being a wall and let it decide. It took a long time. Long enough that the lamp needed trimming, and I trimmed it slow so my hands would have something honest to do. The girl went first, or rather her legs went first, and the boy caught her, and getting her out of the cold became more urgent than being afraid of me, and that's how they came inside. He half-carried her to the hearth. He put her down close to the fire, but not too close. He knew, that boy. He knew you don't put frozen feet straight to a flame, and he arranged her there, and only then did he look around my house, quick, cataloging the exits, the way I do a strange corral. I made mush, That's all I had that was soft enough. Cornmeal and water and a little of the good molasses I kept back for myself. And I spooned it into 2 bowls, and I set both bowls on the floor near them and went back to my chair. Because I understood by then that the floor between us was a border, and I wasn't to cross it uninvited. The boy ate second. I want you to sit with that because I've sat with it for the rest of my life. He was starving. I could see the shape of his own ribs move when he breathed. And he fed her first, watched her get some down, made sure her hands could hold the bowl, and only then did he eat. And even then he ate slow, watching me over the rim, ready to stop and stand if I so much as scraped my chair. I wrote nothing that night after they came in. The ledger just says 2 Indian children, no shoes, girl won't speak, boy won't leave her. I'd written that before I fed them when I still thought they were a thing that was happening to me. I never added a word to that line. Some nights don't fit in a book. They slept by my fire and I sat up in my chair with my rifle across my knees. And if you want to know the truth, I wasn't guarding against them, and I wasn't guarding them from anything outside. I just didn't know what else to do with my hands, and a man will hold what he's used to holding when the ground goes soft under him. Morning showed me more than I wanted. The girl's feet were bad. Not the worst I'd seen. I'd nursed frostbite on grown men and lost 2 toes off old Halloran myself one February, but bad for a body that small. The boys were tougher, more callous than skin, but there was a wound on his left one, a deep split on the wrong color, and he'd been walking on it and saying nothing. I found this out because I knelt down slow with a basin of warm water, and he let me, which surprised me, until I understood he was letting me tend her and only tolerating me tending him because pulling his foot away would have meant admitting it hurt. Stubborn, Lord, that boy was stubborn. It was the first thing I truly knew about him, and it turned out to be the truest. I'll skip the doctoring. It was slow and it was ugly, and the girl cried without sound the whole time I worked the worst of it, tears just running while her face stayed still. And that silent crying did something to me that screaming never could have. Somewhere in there I started talking, just to fill the room. I told them about the ranch and the cattle and my father who built the place and my wife who was 10 years gone and no children, no, never any children. And I heard my own voice say that, and heard how it sounded in that house with those 2 by the fire. And I had to stop and trim the lamp again even though it was daylight. The boy watched my mouth while I talked, not understanding the words, watching them, the way you'd watch a river to learn its habits. By noon he'd said his first English word to me. He pointed at the girl and he said, "Sister." Then he pointed at his own chest and said a name I couldn't make my mouth do. And when he saw me fail at it, he tried again, slower, and I tried again, and we both gave up at about the same time, and something happened that I didn't expect, which was that the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. The country before a smile, the foothills of it. I called him Charlie after that, and I hated myself a little for it, for renaming a boy who had a name, but he took it. He'd point at himself and say, "Charlie," like a joke the 2 of us were in on, and the girl he called by her own name, which sounded like water going over stone, and I never once tried to change hers. That felt important. I don't know why. A man does small penances where he can. They didn't leave. I want to be honest about how that happened, because in the stories a man decides to take in a child and there's music and everyone knows their part. It wasn't like that. Every morning I'd tell myself I'd take them to town, find the mission, find the fort, find someone whose job this was. And every morning there'd be a reason not to. The girl's cough, the weather, a cow calving early. And under all the reasons, the real reason, which I didn't look at straight for a long time, that the house had been quiet for 10 years and it wasn't quiet anymore. I wrote them into the ledger sideways. Flour, extra. Cloth for 2 PR moccasins, traded yellow dog $1.50. Molasses gone through fast. I was accounting for them without admitting I was keeping them. My father would have seen right through me. He'd have said, "Son, you can't ledger your way out of a decision you already made in your chest." The trouble came, as it always does, from town. It was Pettigrew who said it first, at the feed store, loud enough for the others. "Heard you got yourself a couple of little savages up at your place." He said it grinning, like it was friendly, the way the worst things get said. "Fattening 'em for what, Amos?" I want to tell you I said something fine. I said, "They're children, Dell." And my voice was flat and something in it must have carried because he stopped grinning, and the store got that particular quiet, and I paid for my nails and I left. But I heard it start behind me as the door swung shut, the murmur, the shape of it. In that county in that year, A man who fed those 2 children was making a statement whether he meant to or not, and I hadn't meant to, and now I'd have to. I sat in the wagon a while before I drove home. There was a real choice in front of me, and I knew it. I could take them to the fort. It was the sensible thing, maybe even the kind thing. There were people whose whole work was this, and I was one man with no wife and no notion of raising a child, let alone two who'd want someday to know what happened to their own. I wasn't their people. I couldn't teach them who they were. Every honest bone in me knew that keeping them might be the selfish choice dressed up as the good one. I drove home to tell them I was taking them to the fort. I got to the gate at dusk, and there was Charlie up on the corral fence showing the girl how the latch worked. He'd figured my whole place out by then, every tool and gate, and she was laughing. First time I'd heard it. A small sound, rusty, like something used after a long time in a box. He was making it happen on purpose, working that latch like a magician just to hear it. And I sat in the wagon at my own gate, and I understood that I was not going to be able to say the sensible thing, and that this was going to cost me, and that I was going to pay it. I climbed down. Charlie looked over, read my face the way he always did, and something crossed his, some old readiness, some here it comes. Because he'd been left before. I knew that without being told. Everything about how he held her told me he'd learned the hard way that the ground gives out. I don't remember deciding to say it. I remember it was already said. "You'll stay," I told him. "Both of you. This is your place now. Long as you want it, I give you my word." He didn't understand all of it. But he understood word. I'd taught him that one, trading it back and forth over the ledger. This word means this thing. And he understood the weight of how I said it. And he looked at me for a long moment with the whole cold country going dark behind him. Then he got down off the fence and he walked over and he put his small cracked hand flat against my chest, right over the sternum. And he pushed, not hard, just a press, testing whether I'd move, whether I'd give way, whether I was a wall or a thing that would hold. I didn't move. He nodded once, like closing a ledger of his own. And that's where I'd like to tell you it got easier, that the promise once made carried itself. But I'd made it in the warm part of a story before the cold part and the cold part. The cold part came for us in January, and it came for the girl first. The cough that had brought her to my door had never fully left. It would hide for a week, 10 days, and I'd let myself forget it, and then some night it would come back up out of her chest deeper than before. By the middle of January, it wasn't hiding anymore. It sat on her like a second winter. She'd fold up small on the pallet Charlie, and I had built her by the hearth, and she'd cough until her whole body shook, and Charlie would sit behind her with his back against the wall and hold her the way you'd hold something you were afraid the wind would take. I doctored plenty of sick animals and a fair number of sick men. I knew the shape of this. It was in her lungs now, deep, and it was the kind of thing that either turns a corner on its own or doesn't turn at all. There's a helplessness in that country that town people never quite believe. You are 3 days from a real doctor in good weather, and there was no good weather. You have what you have. You do what you can. And the rest you sit up with in the dark, and you don't say the word you're thinking. Charlie stopped sleeping. I'd wake in my chair. I'd taken to sleeping in my chair by then, near them, and he'd be awake always, his eyes open and fixed on her chest, counting her breaths. He'd learned to count in English by then, low under his breath, 1, 2, 3, and I realized one night that he wasn't practicing his numbers. He was making sure the next breath came. He was standing guard over her, breathing the way I'd stood guard over nothing that first night. And I understood then what I'd been doing with that rifle. The same useless holy thing he was doing now, trying to keep a person here by refusing to look away. There was a woman I knew. Near the old Apache camp east of the river, what was left of it, there was a woman the others called on for sickness. I'd met her once years back when she'd set a broke arm for one of my hands better than any doctor would have. I didn't know if she was still there. I didn't know if she'd come for me, for a white rancher in that year with everything that had been done. I had no earthly reason to think she would. I saddled up anyway, before dawn, in the worst of it. Charlie tried to come. I put my hand on his shoulder and I pointed at the girl and I said, "You stay. You keep her breathing, that's the job." And he understood the job part, God help him. He understood being given a post, and he planted himself by her pallet and he took up his counting and he let me go, trusting me. That was the thing that near broke me as I rode out, that he'd decided to trust me, the one thing I'd asked him never to have to do, which was believe a grown man would come back. The ride was 11 miles, and it should have been 6. The Cimarron had frozen and thawed and frozen wrong, and the crossing I knew was a mess of rotten ice and black water. And I lost an hour going up to a ford I only half remembered, and my horse, a good steady bay named Solomon, went into the chest and came up screaming, and I nearly lost him and myself both. I'll spare you the middle of it. There's a stretch where I was off the horse, and in the water to my waist hauling on his bridle and cursing every god I'd ever heard named. And I remember thinking, with the strange flat clarity that comes when you're too cold to be properly afraid, that if I died in this river, those two children would sit by that fire and wait for a man who'd given his word, and they would learn one more time that a word is just a sound a mouth makes. That's what got me out of the river, not wanting to live, not being able to stand being one more liar in that boy's ledger. I found the camp near noon. It was smaller and poorer than I remembered, and the men who came out to meet me had every reason on earth to turn me around, and for a long moment I thought they would. I sat my shivering horse, and I did the only thing I had, which was to tell them the truth in the plainest words I owned. 2 children, Apache, sick the girl in the lungs, at my place. I said the girl's name, the water-over-stone name Charlie called her, because it was the only word of their tongue I had, and I hoped it might do more than my English could. Something moved through them when I said it. I've thought about that 100 times since, and I still don't fully know what it was. Recognition, maybe. Or just the sound of one of their own names in a white man's clumsy mouth, spoken like it mattered. An old man said something, and a younger one answered him hot, and there was an argument I couldn't follow with my life hanging in the middle of it, and at the end of it the woman came out. She was older than I remembered, and she looked at me a long time with eyes that had seen every reason not to help me and helped anyway more than once. She asked me one thing, through the younger man who had some English. She asked if the children were mine. I opened my mouth to say no. And then I thought about that hand pressed flat to my chest, "Are you a wall or will you hold?" And I heard myself say, "Yes." And then, because I couldn't leave it a clean lie, not by blood, by word. The young man told her. She watched my face while he said it. Then she nodded, once, the same economical nod Charlie gave, and I wondered if he'd learned it from people like her, or if it was just what her people did when a thing was decided and there was no more use in talking, and she went to gather her things. We rode back into a blizzard. It had held off all morning like it was waiting to see what I'd do, and now that I'd done it, it came. The woman rode behind me on Solomon's back, light as a bundle of sticks, her arms around a pouch of her medicines and not around me, and we went into that white nothing with the wind trying to unstitch us from the earth. I lost the trail. I found it. I lost it again. There is a particular fear in not being able to find your own land you've walked 10,000 times because the snow has erased it and made you a stranger on it. I have never been more afraid before or since than I was those last 2 miles, because it wasn't my death I was carrying anymore. It was hers, and through hers, the girls, and through the girls, whatever was left of that boy who was sitting by a fire counting breaths and believing in me. We got there past dark. I know we got there because the next thing I have is the door and the heat and Charlie's face turning up, and the way his whole body changed when he saw the woman come in behind me, not relief. It was too big for relief. He knew what she was. He knew what her presence meant and what her medicines were, and he made a sound I'd never heard him make. And he took her straight to his sister without a word to me, the 2 of them dropping to their knees by the pallet in a language I would never share. And I stood in my own doorway dripping river water and snow, entirely unnecessary, and it was the best I ever felt in my life. The girl did not turn the corner that night, or the next. The woman stayed. I gave her my bed and slept in the barn and did not resent 1 minute of it. She boiled things I didn't recognize and made the girl breathe the steam of them and sang low over her in the small hours. And Charlie learned it, whatever it was, learned to make the medicines and hold the bowl and do the singing when the woman slept. And I watched a thing pass between the 3 of them across those days that I had no part in and wanted no part in. It wasn't mine. It was theirs. I had only carried it across a river. On the 4th night, the girl's fever broke. I wasn't in the room. I was in the barn with Solomon, checking the leg he'd cut in the ford, and Charlie came out to get me. He didn't have the English for it. He just stood in the barn door with the lantern light behind him, and he was crying openly, finally, a boy crying like a boy and not like a soldier, and he said, "She breathe, Amos, she breathe good," and I put down the liniment and I went in. She was sleeping, really sleeping deep and even, her chest going up and down in the long, slow rhythm of a body that has decided to stay. The woman sat back against the wall with her eyes closed, spent all the way to the bone. And Charlie stood between us looking from his sister to me and back. And then he did the thing again. He came and put his hand flat on my chest, over the sternum, but this time he didn't push. This time he just left it there, feeling it hold. I put my own hand over his. His was still so small. I keep thinking it should have stopped being small by then, after everything, but it hadn't. It was still a child's hand, cracked at the knuckles, and it lay against my chest and mine lay over his, and neither of us said anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying, and both of us were smart enough, finally, to know it. The woman stayed 2 more days, and then she wanted to go home, and I rowed her back, and this time the river let us cross easy, almost gentle, like it was ashamed of itself. At the camp she got down and she looked at me and she said, through the young man, that the girl would be weak a long while, but she would live. And then she said one more thing, and the young man hesitated before he told me it. And when he told me it, I had to look away at the horizon for a spell. She said, a man is not the one who feeds a child. A man is the one who is still there when the feeding gets hard. I've never forgotten it. I wrote it in the ledger that night, the only sentence in 40 years of that book that wasn't a number or a fact. Wrote it out careful in the margin of a page that was mostly about hay, because I wanted it kept somewhere permanent, and the ledger was the most permanent thing I owned. I thought that was the end of the hard part. I thought we'd crossed our river. I didn't yet know about the letter that was already on its way from the territorial office, or the man who'd sign it, or the law that didn't care one thing about a promise made at a gate in the dark. I didn't know that the fight to feed them had only been the easy fight, and that the fight to keep them was coming up my road in a black buggy on the first warm day of spring. I saw the dust of it a long way off. You always did out there. A rider or a rig announced itself for a mile before it arrived, and I stood at the corral with a curricomb in my hand and watched that dust come, and I knew, the way you know a storm by the color of the light, that it was official. Ranchers don't drive buggies that clean. Only men who work indoors keep a rig that black. His name was Mr. Halstead, and he was from the territorial office, and he had papers, and he was, I'll grant him this, not a cruel man. That was almost the worst of it. A cruel man I could have hated clean. Halstead was a decent, tired functionary doing a thing the law told him to do. And the thing the law told him to do was collect Indian children of a certain age and deliver them to the boarding school 300 miles east, where they would be taught to be something other than what they were, and have their names taken, and their language taken, and their hair cut, and be made into a shape the territory found more convenient. He explained all this to me at my own table. Over coffee I poured because my mother raised me to pour coffee for a guest even when I wanted to put him in the river. He was sorry about it. He said so, and I believe he meant it. He said the school was for their own good, that they'd learn a trade, that it was better than the alternative, that surely I could see there was no lawful place for 2 Apache children on a white man's ranch, that I had no claim, no papers, no standing. That I had done a Christian thing, feeding them through the winter, and now the Christian thing was to let them go where they'd be properly seen to. Charlie and the girl were out at the creek. I'd sent them the moment I saw the dust. Charlie had looked at me and read the whole situation off my face in half a second the way he always could, and he'd taken her hand and gone, and I'd watched him go knowing he understood more than I wished he did. I want to tell you about the decision now, because the whole thing I've been telling you comes down to it. I had in front of me the honest, sensible reading of the situation, and Halstead was speaking it out loud in a reasonable voice. I was one aging man. I had no wife, no papers, no legal standing, no right. The children had no future with me that anyone in that territory would recognize. Maybe the school truly was safer than a ranch where the neighbors called them savages at the feed store. Maybe I was, in keeping them, only serving my own loneliness and calling it love, the way I'd feared at the very start. Every practical, lawful, sensible thing pointed one direction, and it was the direction of Halstead's black buggy. And I knew that if I let them be taken, I could tell myself for the rest of my life that I'd had no choice, that the law had done it, that my hands were clean. And I thought about the woman across the river. A man is the one who is still there when the feeding gets hard. This was the hard part. This, right here at my table, was the whole of the promise coming due. Any fool can feed a child through a cold night. The word I'd given at that gate, long as you want it, I give you my word. That word was worth exactly nothing if it didn't hold against a man with papers. I told Halstead no. He was patient with me. He explained again, more carefully, as though I hadn't understood, that it wasn't a matter of my permission. That he would return with a marshal if he had to. That I was making it harder than it needed to be, and that I would lose, and the only question was whether I'd lose with dignity or with a marshal standing in my yard. I said I understood him completely, and that the answer was still no, and that he was welcome to bring his marshal, and that in the meantime he could finish his coffee or not as he liked, but I had stock to see to. And I stood up. And after a while he stood up too, and he gathered his papers, and at the door he stopped, and he looked at me with an expression I've never fully sorted out, part frustration, and part something that might have been, God knows, respect. And he said, "You know you can't win this." "No," I said, "but I can make it cost more than it's worth, and I can make sure that when they're old enough to ask, somebody tells them a man stood up." I hadn't planned to say it. It just came, the way the promise at the gate had come, out of some part of me that made decisions before the rest of me was consulted. He left. The dust of his buggy going away was the sweetest and most temporary thing I ever watched. Here is what I did in the weeks that followed, and I'll tell it plain because there's no glory in it, only stubbornness, which the woman across the river had named right the first night without knowing she was doing it. I went to town and I found the one lawyer in that country, a drunk named Pierce who'd been something once back east, and I paid him in beef to tell me what the law actually allowed. He was drunk, but he wasn't stupid, and he told me the truth. That as an Indian, the children had almost no standing, but that guardianship was a crack in the wall, that a man could petition to be made legal guardian, that it was rare and it was hard and it would be fought, but that it was not quite impossible. There was a slot for it in the machinery. Halstead's law was strong, but it wasn't seamless, and Pierce, sobering up as he got interested, said he'd never in his life have thought to look for the crack for 2 Apache children, and that he'd help me. And I think he helped me at least half because it was the first thing anyone had asked him to do in years that mattered. It took the whole of that spring and most of the summer. I made the ride to the territorial seat 4 times. I sat in waiting rooms. I stood in front of a judge who looked at me like I was a species of madness. I brought the woman from across the river to speak, and she came, 3 days' travel for me for them. And what she said through the interpreter I never fully learned because I was too busy trying not to weep in a government building, but it moved the judge. I saw it move him. And I brought Charlie. That was Pierce's idea, and I fought it, because I didn't want that boy in a room full of men who'd decide his life like a line in a ledger. But Pierce said the judge needed to see him, needed to see he wasn't a savage or a problem or a line of law but a boy. And so I brought him in a clean shirt he hated, and the judge asked him, gentle enough, "I'll give the man that, whether he wanted to stay with me." And Charlie, who by then had a full year of my English and his own good sense, looked at that judge and didn't say a speech. He said 4 words. He'd thought about it. I could see he'd thought about it. He said, "He came back across the river." That was all. He didn't explain it. He trusted the room to understand, the way I'd been trusting you to understand this whole time, and I watched the judge, who did not know about the ford or the ice or the blizzard or the girl's fever breaking on the 4th night, decide that whatever that sentence meant, it was the kind of thing that ought to count for something. I won't tell you it was a clean victory, because you know by now I don't believe in those. I got guardianship. It was conditional and it was watched, and it came with a stack of obligations and a territorial man who checked on us for years and never once found what he was looking for. Halstead, to his credit, did not bring the marshal. I heard later he'd spoken for us, quietly, in some office I never saw, and I never got to thank him, and I've always been sorry about that. People are seldom the one thing you decide they are. The girl grew up. She lived. That was never certain, and it stayed in my heart, a kind of daily miracle I never got used to. She never lost the cough entirely. Some winters it came back, and I never breathed easy till spring. But she lived. And she laughed that rusty laugh less rustily as the years went. And she kept her name, her real name, the water-over-stone one, and she taught it to me properly when she was grown, and I finally learned to say it right. And the day I said it right she cried, and I pretended not to see so she could have it private. Charlie stayed Charlie by choice. He said he'd earned the name, said it was the name of the boy who crossed the river, and who was I to argue? He runs the place now. My hands got old the way hands do and has got strong, and one spring I woke up and understood the ranch was his, and had been for a while, and I was just a man it let stay, and I was more at peace with that than I've been with almost anything. I still keep the ledger. I'm keeping it now, in fact. This is the ledger, the same book, the 9th of November still there with the blue pen mark I never blotted, and the sentence in the margin about the man who is still there when the feeding gets hard. I read it sometimes when my hands are too stiff to work. I read that first line, 2 Indian children, no shoes, girl won't speak, boy won't leave her, and I think about how little I knew when I wrote it, how I thought it was a thing happening to me, $4 of flour and a problem to be handed off in the morning. There's an empty page at the back I've been saving. I've known for a while what I want written there, and I've never had the nerve to write it, because writing it makes it true, and true means finished. But my hands are worse this winter, and I don't fool myself about winters anymore, so I'll write it now, and I'll trust the 2 of them to find it when I'm gone and to understand it the way Charlie trusted that judge, without my having to explain.